Okay, so for a little bit of a change of pace here, what I'm going to do is basically I took this set of slides from the publisher, and I'm basically going to talk about the slides. So it's going to be a little bit different than me writing things down, but I wanted to make sure you had some sort of lecture with me discussing it. Okay, so there's a few things that we're going to want to do here. The first thing that we're going to want to do is try to understand what poverty itself is. Then we're going to want to try to understand how do we, at least in the United States primarily, try to reduce poverty. How do we create a safety net that stops us from reaching poverty? Then we're going to want to discuss how do we measure the level of inequality being different from poverty, but how do we measure that inequality and what is causing it? And then finally, talking about the things that we would do as a society to try to reduce the level of inequality. So basically, this chapter will be about poverty and inequality, and that those two things coexisting. This was a pretty big movement. Gosh, 9 years ago, 10 years ago. Um, Hard to tell where it is. Could be in Madison, Wisconsin. It looks like it could also be, yeah, it's Madison, Wisconsin. Because I can see here Madison, and I can see here Scott Walker. This is actually around the time I moved to Wisconsin, and basically all these things that they're grumpy about. It ended up being pretty bad, which is part of the reason why I actually came to Hawaii. So I guess these people that have, I wasn't in the crowd here, but I guess they were fighting for me, and I guess I didn't appreciate it enough. So, although it has nothing to do with this right here, up here they were protesting Scott Walker taking office and banning unionized University of Wisconsin employees. And that looks to be what that was about. But one of the but the reason why this is down here was because during the financial crisis, there was also this sort of concern that the government and the Federal Reserve was spending a lot of time talking about how to bail out big banks and Wall Street, and they really weren't talking very much about all of the people and all the suffering that they were doing. So Occupy Wall Street was, okay, if you're not going to give us anything that helps us out personally, fine, but we're going to like occupy the streets. We're going to block the streets and not let anything happen. Okay. So let's actually talk about then how do we actually define poverty. So to define poverty, we need a poverty line. And we need a poverty level of income. To be impoverished, meaning to be in poverty, means that you can't pay for all of your living expenses. Different countries will define that differently. Here in the United States, it's defined as the amount of money it would take you to buy all of your food for a month and multiplying that by 3. Not a very good equation. In fact, one of the critiques of that is that equation is quite dated, that there's no real reason to think that how much you spend on food, would dictate how much you spend on rent and everything else. But basically, poverty in the United States, the poverty line in the United States is determined by 3 times the amount you would spend on food. Just so we can kind of see here how much that would end up costing. It's going to be about, I think, about $12,000 for a single individual. Yeah. 11,770 per person. So about $1,000 a month. That would be pretty bad. And it doesn't go up very much the more people you add on. Family of 4, 2 kids, 24,000. So basically $2,000 a month. That would be about what I pay in rent for. My family size is 6. I think I pay almost that in rent. Because I have 3 bedrooms. I have a 3 bedroom. I live on university housing, faculty housing, and that is about my rent per month, and that's kind of subsidized by all y'all. Um, yeah, so I don't. I guess I can't eat, or I'll have to eat my walls. Um, that's pretty bad. Um, so we have poverty, and then we have income inequality, which would mean let's take all of the income divided among everyone, and how equal is that divided across every individual. And then we have the poverty rate. How many people are actually below that poverty line that we specified? Okay, so you can kind of see these trend lines here. Probably the one thing that most economists are proudest about is between 1960 and 1970 that the poverty rate went down so much. Now, a lot of that was because the 2 presidents at that time that were during that era, for the most part, was President John Kennedy and President Johnson. Johnson, and both of those individuals, especially Johnson, declared what was called a war on poverty, and he got in most of the programs that we think of today when we think of people who are impoverished. Things like food stamps, Medicaid, Medicare, Head Start program. Most of those programs that we think of as helping the poor were all started in that era. And you can see here that the poverty rate has then declined in the 1960s to among its lowest points as covered by this graph. And if we want to feel grumpy about anything, it would be that in this most recent decade, 2010 to 2020, the poverty line is again increasing to what it used to be. So, one concern among individuals who are then designing programs that are structured around poverty is what's called the poverty trap. Can you end up trying to help people and it actually doesn't help them? And especially if you're quite conservative or Republican, the one thing that you're always concerned about is if I help you buy food and give you housing, does that mean you then might not even look for work because you have all your basic needs met? Hence the trap that if you end up starting to work, so for instance, let's just talk about Medicaid. To be on Medicaid, you basically are earning very little money, little to no money, and you can't have more than $2,000 in assets. Well, imagine that you are working very hard, saving money for your first apartment, and you need to save the down payment and everything like that. Well, that's going to easily total over $2,000. So the idea with the poverty trap is, why would you work so hard and try to get your own house or your own apartment when by working so hard, you now get kicked off of the Medicaid program or you become ineligible for it? I'm not, to be honest, most economists themselves are unsure about how large the poverty trap is in the United States. I can't dispute the logic. The logic is correct. If you disincentivize people to work, then they probably will not work as much. But this is slightly my opinion, so just keep that in mind when I say this here. But for any of you who have ever had to be on any of these poverty programs, for myself, I remember as a child having, it's kind of like the equivalent of food stamps. It wasn't food stamps, but it was bulk food. Basically in the late 70s when I was growing up, the government was buying excess food, and then instead of giving food stamps to some people, what they did is they made the food themselves and they gave it to you. So for instance, I got like, I think it was like government cheese I remember getting, and like government peanut butter. It tasted horrible. It was really, really bad. Um, so there certainly was no poverty trap there. And for any of you who've ever had to live on food stamps, it's not that much better. I mean, there's certainly obviously the restrictions. You can only buy cold food, you can't buy hot food. But I mean, food stamps are never enough. It's not, there really aren't really, as much as we want to think of food stamps as being free, it's typically not enough to cover a family's entire food needs, just like Medicaid. Yeah, Medicaid gets you health care if you're poor, but not every doctor, in fact, most doctors do not accept Medicaid. So, and from a realistic perspective, and this is just slightly my opinion, there's not a lot of poverty trap that exists, at least from in my experiences, because usually the assistance programs that exist are not that generous that you would not work. Now, that's not probably true in most places, right? We can certainly, the classic examples, thinking of like Western European countries where the benefits are incredibly generous. Yeah, you might imagine that people then would try to not work as much if they didn't have to. And that's what you see here. So you can kind of see this poverty trap existing here, because what it's doing, as you can see from this graph here, is that if I give people a certain amount of income, let's say $18,000, then if they get that $18,000, whether they work a lot or whether they work a little, then people aren't going to, you basically will see a thing where individuals are not going to work as much. In this case here, if I give everyone $18,000, they could work 2,000. They could work 2,000 hours and get that same amount of money, or they could work far less. They could work 0 hours and get $18,000. So that's kind of what this last bullet point outlines right here. That if everyone gets a certain level of income, why would you work very hard? What incentive would there be? And again, you can structure this differently. What's interesting for economists here is the way that this is a kinked budget constraint. And the kink basically means that individuals can work a certain amount of time, but then the trade-off becomes 50, in this case, 50%. What if for every hour I work, I have to give back 50 cents? Then what you see is that individuals, if I try to reduce the budget constraint here, as opposed to the previous graph, where I just gave everyone $18,000, but what if I say for every hour you work, you have to give back 50 cents of every dollar you earn? It, in essence, reduces the degree of the poverty trap by slightly incentivizing individuals to work. And what you see is that people will work more. So what these two slides basically point out here is that the poverty trap is certainly not something to ignore. On the other hand, it's not something that should stop a society from starting a poverty reduction program just because we think that people are going to be lazy. Generally speaking, they will not be. And what that requires us to then do is to think about, who do we try to help? Do we want to try to help the individuals who are nearly poor, meaning they're earning above the poverty line? or do we just want to help the actual poor? Um, so some of the other things that we kind of try to do here is we do have the earned income tax credit. That's probably one of the more successful anti-poverty programs, if only because what it does is it says, okay, you're working, you're not earning a lot of money, you're still poor, even though you're working hard. Basically, instead of the government, the government to encourage you to keep working, even though you're getting so little money, they will basically give you all of the tax money you pay back. So, right, so let's, again, this is not my salary, but let's say I earned $200,000 a year, but I was taxed 25%, which would mean even though my pay is $200,000, I only get $150,000 after taxes. But let's say that was poor. Let's say that having $200,000 was considered poor. I could apply for this earned income tax credit and I could basically keep all $200,000. Essentially, this is what exists now. When you fill out your taxes, some of you may even see this on TurboTax or H&R Block. If you're working a pretty low pay job and you're still poor, even single individuals, you don't have to have kids, but you can get some of your tax money back. It's not like getting a tax refund. That's what you get when you pay too much into the system. This is a tax credit, meaning it acts like you've paid the tax even though you really didn't. And then we have the SNAP program, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. That's what we call food stamps, or EBT. And that's federally funded. That's basically money that goes right back into the communities. Right when Hawaii pays it on the 5th of the month or the 10th of the month for some of you, when they pay that out, right, everyone goes to Costco, everyone goes to Sam's Club, everyone goes to Walmart. The grocery stores sell a lot of groceries, and that goes right back into the community, and we're feeding people. So in terms of how do you stimulate the economy, it turns out that food stamps actually really do a good job of stimulating the economy. That's not an opinion. That's actually factual that food stamps do stimulate local grocers like a Times, or again, even just imagine you can use food stamps in Chinatown. You can use food stamps at a lot of, at farmers markets. A lot of farmers markets also take food stamps. So if we look at the 4 biggest programs, that would be food stamps, which I just said right here, temporary assistance for needy families. That's basically a cash payment for a very poor family. Then you've got your Section 8 housing. That would be housing and urban development. Your Section 8 housing. And then you have everything else. If you think about how much is being spent, if we add this all up together, I know it looks like a lot, and I'm not trying to pass a great deal of judgment. But if we look at the total amount being spent, which they're saying here is about, in 2013, so this data is a little bit old here, but $106 billion. Obviously, we spend a great deal more on the other significant portions of the budget, which would be paying interest on the debt we've already acquired, national defense, even things like certain construction projects or even other things. That's all far, far exceeds the amount that we spend on income security. So let's look at Medicaid. So Medicaid, again, starts in the 1960s. And so that really represented the first time that poor individuals, whether you were old or not, had access to health care. So if you were poor but not old, this would be your health care. This is paid for by the state and by the federal government. They share how it's paid for. The states administer it. The federal government generally pays about 70% of it, and then the state picks up the rest. For many states, this ends up being one of the largest portions of their budget. The guidelines for Medicaid are set up by the federal government, and the state just implements it. But if you're old and poor, you can actually have both Medicare and Medicaid. That works out incredibly well, such that you can end up paying absolutely nothing. Medicare generally would pay out first for the health care that you need, and then Medicaid will pick up the difference. For those of you who's you think this applies to your grandparents, this would be what's known as Quest integration. We know of Medicaid here on the islands as Quest, but if you have Quest integration, basically the state will pay the Medicare premiums for that individual, and then Medicare will pay out health expenses first, and then Medicaid will pick it up second. But Medicaid, as much as it provides health care for the poor when they had nothing, and it is actually especially generous, and for a good reason, it's especially generous to women who are having children. It'll generally pay for things like formula, pay for diapers even, pay for prenatal care. The idea with Medicaid, the reason why there's an investment in this is because, right, isn't there like that old phrase like ounce of prevention, pound for cure, or something like that, or something along those lines, right? That basically the idea is that if you are of ill health, it's cheaper for you to try to manage a disease if you know you have it early on than just waiting for you to have to like drag your near corpse to the body, to the hospital. So the idea is that you spend a lot of money on prevention of a bigger problem. But the problem with Medicaid is that the reimbursement rates are so low. So doctors, right, they might charge me, someone who's on HMSA, let's say $300 for the office visit, because I just have typical insurance. But if I had Medicaid, the same doctor might only get like $30 or $40. And doctors aren't really all rich, right? They have to decide what insurance will we take. And doctors have a choice of whether they are going to take Medicaid or not. And this is, doctors usually like to help people. That's why they got into the profession. But they're also small business owners, right? Unless they work for Kaiser, they are a business owner. And they might just say, geez, my cost of running my clinic, I have to get more than $30 a patient. I don't even know if this patient, has a whole host of other issues that I might not even be able to deal with. And they're certainly not going to pay a lot because I'm just going to get what the Medicaid rate is. And so the best doctors, the ones of the highest quality, generally speaking, and again, these are very broad brushstrokes. I don't want you to in some sense, you're paying for a class where I'm telling you facts and I'm trying to just tell you when I'm saying an opinion, what my opinion is. But the best doctors generally are not going to take Medicaid. They're the best doctors. They know they can command the highest prices. So why would they want to take it? The only example I can tell you from my own personal experiences with any of this is my wife, when she, was a child, was on Medicaid. And this is before I met her, she ended up getting her appendix taken out, even though she didn't have appendicitis. I'm not sure why the doctor decided to take it out. Maybe he thought that was the problem, but she ended up not having appendicitis, but the doctor just took out the appendix. I'm not saying that Medicaid doctors are all bad, but you're not going to get the best of, generally speaking, you're not going to get the best of the best. You're going to get either like a pretty old doctor who just wants to do the right thing, and they're in their kind of like twilight years and they're just trying to do the right thing. Or you get a very socially centered doctor who really wants to do good things and doesn't care about being able to pay back their significant medical bills, medical education bills. And you can kind of see these things here. Fortunately, when you look at this, children are the far largest number of individuals on Medicaid. That's good because children who have health care coverage will have their issues dealt with so that when they become adults and they are working, they will not have significant health care issues. Medicaid also would cover individuals who have significant disabilities, physical or psychological. And you kind of see some of these with blind and disabled, where the expenses are going. But when you look at this, and I'm not trying to dispel rumors. I'm not trying to take a political stand here, but I like facts. I appreciate numbers. And there's really not a lot of disputing of the numbers. Now, these are from probably 2013, just like the other slides, but the numbers have not changed very much. Most of the people on Medicaid are not adults. I'll repeat that again. Most of the individuals on Medicaid are not adults. So I know there's this popular notion that the people on Medicaid are just people who are adults who are just too lazy to work. Yes, I'm sure there are some. I'm sure there is a lazy person that is on Medicaid somewhere. But the vast, vast majority are not. And when you look at how many individuals, that about 1 in 4 individuals on Medicaid would be presumably a healthy adult, as you would see here. But even then, the expenses are pretty low. Most of the spending for the Medicaid program is for the blind and disabled, primarily because their needs are so expensive, right? We're talking about lots of rehabilitation. We're talking about individuals with severe autism, born, too early and then, reduced lung function for the rest of their life. That's the biggest portion of the expenses. Again, what that requires us as a society then to say is, what is our obligation to the blind and the disabled? Here we are saying we will provide health care. We can change that as a society if that's our choice. But it's somewhat, it's not exactly, if we make cuts to the Medicaid program, we might be getting rid of the individual who is lazy and is on the program, but we're also hurting, obviously, the blind and disabled. I say this only because I know one of the things that was attempted a few months ago, if not a year ago, was this idea that to get Medicaid, you would have to submit to a drug test. I guess based on the notion that those who collect Medicaid are taking too many drugs and so they don't work, they're lazy, but we provide them health care, but then they just spend all their time taking drugs. It turned out to not be legal, but I mean, if someone were to ask, no one does ask me, but if someone were to ask me, is this an appropriate policy? I mean, I would say the legality, I have no idea. That's up to the lawyers to figure that out. But I would say in terms of the purpose of the Medicaid program, it's really not, doesn't seem to be the issue. It's not really a way to save money. I mean, if anything, my only critique of the Medicaid program is about the providers. I just don't, personal opinion is what I'm saying right here. I just don't think it's fair that we have a healthcare system where just because you're poor but have insurance, that you should get worse care, worse doctors. I think if you have a serious health issue, you should have access to just as good a care as someone with the same issue who happens to have more money. But that's my personal opinion. You might just, it's I'm pretty capitalistic, so not very many. I just there's just a seems to be for me it's a fairness issue, but free to disagree. Now, let's talk about income inequality. So what that means here is how rich are the very rich, how poor are the very poor. The way that we do this is we basically order everyone's income and we divide the income into quintiles, meaning fifths. And then if everything was equal, then the lowest 20% of the population would have the first 20% of the income. The 40%, the first quartile and the second quartile, 40% of the population would have 40% of the income, 60, 80, and 100. Right? So the idea would be it's kind of a 1-for-1 in terms of percent of the population and percent of the income. If it turns out that the first 20% of the population has 1% of the income, then we're going to fall below that 45-degree line. What that does is it creates for us a Lorenz curve, which you see right here. So this dashed line right here is denoting where we have perfect equality. That perfect equality, saying again, 20% of the population has 20% of the income. 40% of the income, 40% of the population. 60% of the income, 60, and so on and so forth. But that in 2011, so the data is a little bit old, but it hasn't changed that much. What we're saying here is that 20% of the income, if we do 20% of the population ends up having the richest 20% end up having 60% of the income. And that the poorest individuals, you can see how it's getting very steep here. You may be going up from like 90th percentile to 100th percentile, even though it's 20% of the, it's 20% of the income, the cumulative share. So why are they poor? It ends up being that it could just be no fault of anyone else. Rich people tend to like rich people. They generally get along, right? Because they're both looking at, they both shop at Neiman Marcus. They both drive a Lexus. They both drink fancy wine. Poor people generally hang out with poor people. Rich people generally hang out with rich people, generally speaking. But also, as the second bullet point identifies for us, is that what happens as well is, imagine, now again, my wife and I are married, we have kids. I could not imagine the complexity of one of us alone trying to do all that. And if that were the case, we definitely probably would be poor, right? Because a lot of our expenditures would have to be, our expenses would be higher and our income would be lower. We wouldn't be able to work as much, and we'd have to spend more money on things like childcare and other kinds of things. So those single parent households tend to be very poor. Additionally, generally speaking, those who have a good education, are highly skilled, tend to have more income. And then we also have this idea, too, that we do have these educational differences that make people have more income. But we also have this idea, too, that that there are just individuals that went to a good school but aren't necessarily more productive. They just had the name notoriety of being at that good school. Certainly we can see that here on the islands, that we say certain things about people who went to certain schools. And that contributes to the inequality. But it contributes to the inequality in a way where we'd say it's not deserved, it's just the unfortunate way that things are. Don't worry about this slide. I just want to try to keep this lecture a little bit easy here. Okay, So how do we then try to control the level of income inequality? The biggest way that we do that here in the United States is through the tax program. The tax program, federal taxes, yeah, we have to pay bills as a federal government, but the reason why we charge individuals who make more money, we charge them a higher percent in taxes, is because we redistribute income from the rich to the poor. That might bother some of you a great deal. Totally fine. That's your own political philosophy. But that is the intent of the taxation program, is to try to reduce income inequality with what's called a progressive tax system. So in a progressive tax system like here in the United States, the higher the income you earn, the higher your marginal tax rate is. Now, what are easy things we can try to do to reduce inequality? Well, the biggest things that we can do is it's kind of some of the things we're trying to do here, even in Hawaii. Can we find a way to give greater access to preschool? Preschool is basically paid for by individuals. I never went to preschool. My wife did not go to preschool. Our kids went to preschool, but it's because we both worked very hard because that was important to us, that they get to do that. Well, imagine if I was dead and it was just my wife doing it. I doubt our kids would go to preschool because her income would be a lot lower. And now my kids are screwed. Not only because I'm dead and they would miss me, but also because they can't go to preschool. Whereas Richie Rich gets to go to preschool, and now my kid is screwed. We could also do things, though, too, like improving access to daycare, even improving the schools that my kids would have to go to from a public standpoint, allowing there to be loans for people to go to school, or trying to do more grants, but also, too, just trying to prohibit discrimination, making housing and making jobs open to all individuals. Then there's this other idea, too, like, should we impose taxes on people's estates? Right now, if you die, you will probably not pay very much in taxes when you're dead. Because you have to have made a lot of money. More than $5.43 million. That's in 2015. If I'm not mistaken, the Trump tax cuts of 2017 increased that even farther. So you'd have to be a pretty rich dead person to actually have your estate be taxed. So the reason why that matters is because some people are rich only because their grandfather was rich, and their wealth keeps getting passed on and on and on. And then you see the rich person around you and you're like, wow, that guy's a real dumbass. Like, how do you become so rich? And his grandfather was rich. Right? It's kind of a new phenomenon, especially here in the United States, that used to not be the case for the most part. But it's increasing that people are able to pass on a pretty sizable chunk of wealth from one generation to the next, and obviously then not helping out others. But we do face this trade-off. I mean, if we didn't face this trade-off, I'm sure you all would say, yeah, I want more people to have stuff. I like equality, and I don't think a lot of us would dispute it. But to the extent that we try to make things equal for each other, we do reduce output. So there is a trade-off. We reduce output because we reduce the incentives to do things. So obviously we have to judge that. Now, again, you can't go the other way either, though. You can't make things so unequal and just say because we want to have a more efficient society. Somewhere you need to have to bridge the two together. Okay, so that kind of completes our discussion of poverty here. And you can look at the bullet points of the other lecture I created here, but I will keep any and all questions to this PowerPoint lecture that I made here.